the O'Farrell government has been talking with the development industry. And the development industry has said, all of these numerical controls that are in planning, you know, like you can only go 4 stories high, or you can only have a certain amount of floor space ratio, which is really solid and measurable. You have to have a certain amount of backyard, or you have to have a certain amount of setback from the sides. All of those numerical controls, the development industry has convinced the government are very arbitrary, really rigid, really not flexible enough. So the development industry has convinced the government that instead of having these annoying numerical controls, which can actually restrain development, they're going to have things called performance-based controls for our planning. Now, performance-based controls sounds kind of nice, because they say things like development that fits the existing, the desired future streetscape, or development of a height that is not imposing, or sufficient backyard for recreation, or sufficient setback to allow for natural light. But of course, with those kind of woolly performance-based controls, even if you had it been decided by a local council, I can tell you now it would be a nightmare, it would be a bloodbath in council if you had those kind of decisions being made. But if you've got those kind of performance-based controls being decided by a private certifier paid for by the developer, you've actually got almost no rules at all for planning. It's really just whatever the developer can convince the private certifier would be good. And given the private certifier is paid for the developer, it's going to be a pretty low threshold. And that's the essential future for planning under this green paper. The government was going to convert the green paper to something called a white paper, which is a far more detailed, almost a draft of the legislation. And that was going to be released in November of last year. The government's been very delayed in implementing the white paper. And in fact, we heard only last week that it's not likely to be released until the end of April. The next stage, the white paper, which is kind of the detailed legislation. I think there are 2 reasons for the delay. The first reason for the delay is they're still consulting with the development industry about making sure that the white paper keeps them happy. And just as an aside, when the government released its green paper last year, about the only organisation that gave it unqualified support, and in fact said it meets all 10 of their key criteria, was the Urban Task Force, the pro-developer paid-up lobby group for the development industry. So it ticks all 10 boxes from the Urban Task Force, the green paper, and the government wants to make sure their white paper also does that. Now, it was going to be released last year, so a draft has actually been prepared. A number of people have seen the draft, and we know for a fact they're consulting with the development industry on the draft. They're also having difficulty about working out how to deliver the infrastructure for their white paper and how it links to infrastructure delivery. And you can see with the discussion we have about Newcastle about how important infrastructure delivery is. And I can tell you now, the developers are squirming to try and get off the hook of actually being held responsible for the delivery of any infrastructure under this government's new reforms. And within the white paper, there's a proposition that it would be unfair and an unreasonable restraint on development if developers had to supply all the necessary infrastructure for their new development. That would be a constraint on development. And there's floated in the green paper is a proposal that existing residents will be levied by an extra rate in order to meet new infrastructure which may have some improvement on their amenity. Who will determine that link? Well, almost certainly that'll be determined by a bunch of bureaucrats in the planning department, and almost certainly not by your local council or locally elected representatives. To give some idea about how radical the proposals the government has on planning controls are, one of their proposals was to put in place something called enterprise zones. Now, enterprise zones has got a sort of nice coalition-y feel to it. If you're a coalition supporter, you hear the phrase enterprise zone, you get a little warm, fuzzy glow in you. If you're an ordinary citizen, you should be deeply fearful though, because the Green Paper is proposing enterprise zones within which there are few, if any, planning controls. Think about it, few, if any, planning controls. And they're proposing to have enterprise zones that may cover entire local government areas. So you can have, effectively, all of Cessnock Council without any planning controls at all. Just remove all the planning controls from Cessnock, remove all the planning controls from Maitland, and the developers can build whatever they want. The only constraint is if they can get funding from the finance markets to build it. There is a glimmer of hope. In fact, there's quite a bright spark of hope in terms of the campaign about getting decent planning laws. And that is an organisation that's taken root just in the last 9 months, called the Better Planning Network. The Better Planning Network? The Better Planning Network is a umbrella group of residents, environment and other heritage groups, which now has, at last count, just last week, more than 300 member groups under the Better Planning Network. And the Better Planning Network is now getting people connected and engaged and making submissions on planning in a way that I don't think we've seen before in New South Wales. Now, we work very closely with the Better Planning Network, but they are absolutely a non-partisan body. And to give you some idea of how non-partisan they are, just next month in Parliament, I'll be co-hosting an event with Fred Nile and others to ensure that the Better Planning Network can take their message directly into the Parliament of New South Wales. Yeah, well, I wouldn't say bedfellows, but you work with who you need to work with in politics. But last year, when the government was trying to water down some key planning controls through what I'd call a mid-term drink that they were going to give to the development industry, the development industry is concerned about the slow pace of the delivery of these white paper reforms, and they want to get out and knock things over as quick as can be. And the government, in order to respond to the pressures from the development industry to give them something mid-term, put an amending piece of legislation to amend the existing Environmental Planning and Assessment Act to strip out a whole lot of controls around development control plans. Would have created untold damage to the existing planning laws. And they thought they were just going to sneak it through in a fairly quiet term in Parliament, that no one much was looking. We obviously were concerned about it as Greens in Parliament. We did some analysis, sent out some information, got a small amount of media attention. But I've got to say, once we communicated that information to the Better Planning Network, and the Better Planning Network then communicated it to its residents groups and heritage groups and environment groups, a number of councillors started passing motions across the state condemning the changes. Well, the letters started coming in, the submissions started coming in, the phone calls started happening. And a bit of an avalanche started at the end of last year when this planning proposal was working its way through the New South Wales government. And that response at the time forced the government to change its direction. And they stripped away half of their proposed changes from that amending legislation. That happened because the Better Planning Network, local councillors and Greens and others actively engaged and made their voice heard. Since then, the Better Planning Network's gone from about 100 members to more than 300 members. It's going to be a fundamental tool for democratic accountability as we work our way through these planning papers, through these planning reforms. And for me, working alongside of, together with where we can, those kind of groups is the way we will hopefully hold the government to account. But let's be clear about it. They're going to deliver a very pro-developer set of changes to the planning laws when this white paper comes out.